So for any of you who are spiritually unresolved, this is a big part of what drives this church and all churches is Jesus, as he's departing, he says, now I want you to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. And then notice this part, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And I'll be with you always to the very end of the age. And it just stood out to me for the first time. Jesus said, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And then I'm looking at Matthew chapter 7, and I realize, oh my goodness, right here, Jesus tells us that the difference between lives that thrive and lives that fold is this one thing. People who put the words of Jesus into practice. Whoever hears my words and puts them into practice is the one who builds their house on a rock. Let's talk about the houses. There's all these similarities, right? Both parties hear the same words of Jesus. They both sat there and understood Jesus, listened to him, let his words flow into them. Both parties hear his words. Both parties build a house. That's that metaphor for what we're going to build with our life, our energies, our passions. Both houses seem to have strong outward appearance. You look at them and you would never know. You don't know what kind of foundation a house has just by an outward visual inspection. Those look habitable. Those look like strong houses. But here's the difference. The party who has the life that survives is the party who heard Jesus' words and put them into practice. Chose to obey. Chose to surrender. What does it mean to put the words of Jesus into practice? So my life went something like this. I grew up in a church planter's home, have really great parents, so appreciative of them. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. I went away when I was 18 years old to Oregon, grew up in Colorado to go to Bible college, and I just started gathering all kinds of information, had the opportunity to go on to some graduate school studies, and there's all this information I've received. But I'll tell you something, all of the information about God, as important as it is, doesn't necessarily strengthen my life. It's my decision to actually obey the words of Jesus. I can hear them all day long. My parents paid me to memorize scriptures. I can quote you a good amount of scriptures. But if I don't obey the scriptures, I'm just a listener. And I don't want to be a listener. I don't want you to be a listener. I have a couple of questions. Number one, I began to ask myself this question: am I a practitioner or a listener? So am I the person that hears the words of Jesus and actually puts them into practice? Like the tough words of Jesus. Like, love your neighbor as yourself. I have the craziest neighbor in the world, literally. My wife can affirm, I can't talk about it back home because she's my neighbor. But she's like the wild cat woman. She's got like 14 cats, and she calls the cops on us all the time. And I'm like, Jesus, you want me to love her because she's the crazy cat woman. And I have to decide, am I just going to hear Jesus' words to love your neighbor, or am I going to put those words into practice? And it has been so difficult. It's brutal. Will I be a listener? It's easy. It's fairly easier to be a listener, to just be somebody who's around the things of God, to be involved in a church. You can even be involved in a small group. But Jesus says that won't build a life that survives storms. Are you an actual practitioner? Do you do what I say? And now we get into this whole thing of lordship, where I can say, absolutely, Jesus is Lord. You know what James says? James chapter 2, verse 19. James says this: oh, you acknowledge that God is there and he exists. And he says, good for you. The demons in hell believe that. It's not just about what I believe. That's a great starting point.